Welcome, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. I see we have 84 people now connected who are anxious to hear the presentation. So I'm very pleased that everybody's interested. Thank you for your patience. My name is Brian Lucas. I'm the manager of the Governance and Social Development Resource Center, the GSDRC. And this event is one in a series of public seminars that we're organizing, which are supported by the UK Department for International Development as part of DFID's professional development activities for its own staff. And these include a series of reading packs, short e-learning courses, and some other publications. There's been a lot of interest in development circles in various approaches to behavior change, and especially in the role of social norms in maintaining patterns of behavior that are considered harmful. We know that people are not purely rational actors. Our behavior is very strongly influenced not only by purely rational considerations, but by what we consider to be typical, acceptable, and appropriate behavior by the standards of people around us. And social norms are generally taken for granted and are so deeply ingrained that people are often not even able to articulate them clearly, although by their nature we can certainly recognize when they're being violated. But beliefs and attitudes and social norms have been implicated in perpetuating a host of harmful practices. And our speakers today are going to discuss this problem. How do we engage with behavior change and social norms that have been used to justify discrimination and violence against women and girls? We have two presenters today. Emma Fulu is a global expert on violence against women and girls. She's the founder and director of the Equality Institute in Melbourne, Australia, and where she works to advance equality and prevent violence against women through research, innovation, and creative communications. She was the program manager recently for a very large DFID-funded global program on what works to prevent violence against women and girls that invested £25 million over 5 years in activities aimed at preventing violence against women and girls. Heise is an internationally recognized expert on intimate partner violence and director of the Center on Gender Violence and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she is a senior lecturer. She serves as research director of STRIVE, an international research consortium dedicated to studying the structural drivers of HIV, including gender inequalities, stigma and criminalization, livelihood options, and alcohol use. And we're also pleased to welcome Elizabeth Mills from the Institute of Development Studies, who will serve as a discussant in today's event. Elizabeth is a social anthropologist who researches the political economy of gender and global health, women's political participation, legal and policy strategies for addressing discrimination. She currently convenes the Sexuality, Poverty and Law program at IDS. So Emma and Laurie will each give a short presentation, about 15 minutes long, drawing on the reading packs that they've produced for DFID's professional development program, and then invited Elizabeth to give a short response to their presentations. And then we will open up to invite questions from the audience. So you can type your questions in the chat box that you should be able to see on your screen. Despite our delay, we'll still have a fair amount of time for questions, although we will have to still draw the event to a close at 11:30 UK time. So let me turn the floor back over to Emma Fulu.
Hi everyone. Okay, hopefully you can see me, hear me. All good? Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's very exciting to see so many people joining this webinar. And I think, yeah, I was saying, I think that kind of reflects the level of interest, or the increasing level of interest in this issue at the moment. It certainly seems to have, you know, after many years working on this, it seems to have, you know, really reached, I guess, a sort of global level of awareness in terms of being one of the most significant human rights development and public health issues of our time. So, I think that it's sort of particularly reflected most recently in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 3 targets now that are in some way related to addressing violence against women and girls. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what we know at the moment and what are some of the gaps in our knowledge. And I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work now. Okay, can we see?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, great. Yes, so I wanted to start, I mean, I think the first reading gives you an overview of the global prevalence, and this is the WHO a couple of years ago has managed to put together global and regional prevalence rates of violence against women. And I think, you know, this wouldn't have been possible just 10 years ago, or because there's been such a large number of prevalence studies done in the last sort of 5 to 10 years that's made this possible. And we know perhaps the most about intimate partner violence, even though we know violence against women includes multiple forms such as sexual harassment, female genital cutting, femicide, so-called honour crimes, which I've included a reading on at the end. But intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence against women and girls globally, and it's probably what we have the most evidence on at this point. So while we have this global prevalence, we have these regional rates that hopefully you can see in the map, and you can see there's some variation there. But when we drill down further, if we look at sort of country level or site levels prevalence rates, we see perhaps an even greater level of variation and diversity. And this slide here shows some results from the UN multi-country study on men and violence, and this is men's reported rates of perpetration of intimate partner violence across 9 sites in the Asia-Pacific region. And we see here, you know, ranging from 25% in the rural site in Indonesia, all the way up to 80% of men in Bougainville, PNG, reporting that they had perpetrated physical or sexual violence against a female partner in their lifetime. And the patterns of violence also vary. So in some countries we see physical, I don't know if you can see my clicker, if anyone can see my, if you can see, can you see the mouse moving? No, anyway.
We can see the mouse moving, yeah. The text is a little too small to read, but if you can describe what you're pointing at, that would...
So you can see, so blue is physical partner violence only, green is sexual violence only, and the pinky colour, purple colour, is both physical and sexual violence. So in some countries, this is Bangladesh, we have more physical violence than sexual violence. In other countries here, Cambodia, we have more sexual violence than physical violence, and in Papua New Guinea and Papua Province, Indonesia, we have a high proportion of men reporting both types of violence. So the prevalence rates vary, the patterns vary across sites. And one of the readings I've included is Laurie's paper recently published in Lancet Global Health, which starts to look at kind of multi-level sort of factors and to help try and explain some of this diversity in population level prevalence, which is a new area that is we're just starting to understand more about. So then when we ask, you know, what is the cause of violence? Again, this is, you know, some of Laurie's, drawing upon some of Laurie's work. But now it's pretty well established that violence against women and girls is not caused by one single thing. It's caused by multiple factors that operate across the individual level, the relationship level, community level, and society levels. And one of the papers I've included looks at how even globalization and global level influences are influencing all of these things. And perhaps we don't think of it initially, but for example, global patterns around new religious or more conservative religious ideologies, for example, and how they influence gender norms in communities, how they may be, for example, restricting women's access to divorce, is something I talk about. We look at how urbanization, for example, might be creating greater social isolation for women, which is a risk factor for violence. and how it's can be shifting social norms, and how it may be increasing or decreasing our acceptability of violence in certain areas, but that we need to take into account how that this isn't a static model, that these things are constantly changing, potentially for the better, and that's what we're trying to promote with prevention work, but also potentially there's things going on that might be increasing the risk of violence that we need to be cognizant of. Historically what we've had is, or from what we have in the research so far, is we've developed, I guess, a bit of a laundry list of what we call risk factors. They're factors that are seen to increase the likelihood of a woman experiencing violence or the likelihood of a man perpetrating violence. But we're kind of limited a bit by what we've measured in quantitative surveys and also what we can measure. We know that those factors aren't necessarily causal. We know that they don't necessarily have a direct pathway to violence, and we need to understand a bit more about how they play out, how are they related to each other, and if they're perhaps really reflecting a bigger driver that we haven't measured, or we don't know how to measure very well yet. So this is some, again, findings from the men's perpetration study in Asia. But these are the factors that came out to be a risk factor for men's perpetration. So we have here, these green factors all relate to childhood trauma. So the man's own experiences of physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing his mother being abused, and emotional abuse and neglect. And they were all associated with increased rates of perpetration. Here we have these orange factors. We've got here transactional sex, higher number of sexual partners, lower gender equitable attitudes, and controlling behaviour and frequent quarrelling. Now, it's not that we think that having multiple sexual partners causes violence. Rather, it's that these factors, we think, reflect, for example, in this case, a model of masculinity that's associated with heterosexual dominance, or control over women. So we need to start to unpack the risk factors that we often talk about and think, what is it that they're actually telling us about the root causes of violence? These two here, the darker blue, we've got gang involvement and fighting with weapons, and this reflects, again, a model of behaviour where men use violence as a means of resolving conflict, or where it reflects a normalisation of violence within that group. So that's sort of where we're at with we need a lot more work around to understand causal pathways and these underlying root drivers of violence, and make sure that we're addressing them rather than just a single risk factor here or a single risk factor there. From this, I mean, we've been building up this kind of evidence base for many years about, okay, if we understand the causes of violence, then that means we can prevent it, or that's the idea anyway, that we need to address those causes to be able to stop it happening in the first place. And I think that's where the field has been moving over recent years, and there's one of the readings is Ellsberg's article in the Lancet special issue, which really did a systematic review of what types of interventions are most effective in preventing violence. And the DFID-funded What Works to Prevent Violence program also did an evidence review looking at some of these things. And look, the evidence base is still quite nascent, and there's a lot more evaluations from high-income countries than low-income countries, for example. In a lot of cases, evaluations don't actually measure the primary outcome of violence occurrence. So they might measure gender attitudes, or they might measure, some other indicator, but don't go to the next step of actually measuring if the program has resulted in a decrease in rates of violence. Again, we don't know much about population level change. We don't know much about vulnerable groups in particular. and most evaluations tend to have a short follow-up period. Now I think it looks like people can't see the small writing, so you might not be able to see this. But this is a summary of the types of interventions that we found based on the limited evidence that exists to be the most effective or promising. So green is effective, blue is promising, so we see an impact on risk factors but not yet on the outcome of violence. Yellow is conflicting evidence, and pink or red is what we see to be ineffective in preventing violence. So that's stopping it before it starts. So some of the most effective types of interventions we see, for example, is microfinance combined with gender transformative approaches. It's important to note that microfinance on its own hasn't been as effective in preventing violence. It's this combined work with gender transformation that's important. Community mobilization programs like SASE in Uganda have been effective. Group education or relationship, group level education work, so and community outreach has been effective in some cases. Relationship level interventions like Stepping Stones in South Africa. And then we see parenting programs and whole of school interventions promising. We don't have enough evidence, but they're certainly moving in the right direction. Bystander interventions at the moment the evidence is conflicting. So some interventions show that it's effective, and some interventions have found that it isn't effective. And then we have a lot of response type mechanisms, proactive police arrest, specialised courts, which we don't have enough evidence really at the moment. There's some suggestion that they're conflicting, but we need to really build up the evidence base. The thing that's not working, and it's important I think to think about this when you plan your work, we often invest in communications campaigns and we think they're going to change the world. We found that single component communication campaigns are not effective in preventing violence. Communication campaigns that are combined with outreach and a long term and a sort of more around social mobilization have some evidence of effectiveness, but it's these sort of short-term communication campaigns that fundamentally they can't change social norms and the complexities that we're dealing with around violence. So some of the overarching principles, or I guess the common best practice things we found out of the studies, is that, you know, effective program elements, they're participatory, they have multi-component elements, so they work across different levels. More effective ones are the ones that have skill-building components. They're not just sharing information or trying to change attitudes, but they actually have an element of building skills. They address multiple risk factors or work across multiple settings, and they come from a strong theory of change. I'm going to go quick because this is my last slide and I know we're a bit behind time. And there's obviously a lot more that's covered in the readings, but there are still many gaps. Gaps in our knowledge base around understanding violence and different forms of violence, but also in terms of understanding interventions and intervention effectiveness. Intimate partner violence we know the most about, I think probably followed by non-partner sexual violence, but we know much less about the other forms of violence against women. We know more about what's happening at the individual level, but less about what's driving population level differences, and Laurie can perhaps talk about that. As I said before, we don't know much about really around causality and pathways. What is leading from one, you know, for example, that we know that people who have experienced abuse as children are much more likely to end up in violent relationships. But what's the pathway through which that's happening, and where can we intervene? We don't know much about marginalised groups, women with disabilities, Indigenous women, LGBTI, etc. We know much less about those groups. We don't know as much about what works in conflict settings, and costing and scale-up is, I think, a huge area of interest, and and a lot of people are working towards, but still early days. And epigenetics, which I think is a fascinating area, which is looking at how sort of the biological drivers, how do they interact with the environment to understand violence and perpetration and experiences. So that's, I think, it for me. My email address is there. You're always welcome to send me an email, and I look forward to talking to you and hearing some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Could we move on to Laurie? Could you give your opening presentation?
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I hope the rest of our audience can.
Great. Let me just do this. So I'm going to just say a little bit about the role of social norms in this entire picture. I wonder if I should, can I make this larger? Let's see. There.
At the moment, we don't see anything. I know you don't have a webcam on, but you have a presentation?
Okay, you don't see the talk.
No.
Laurie, I think you might need to hit the share screen button.
Okay, so that is the green one?
Yeah.
That's what I thought I did. Hold on a second. Sorry, folks.
There we go. I think it's...
Something's coming?
Yeah.
Now you can see?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot. I'm going to say just a bit today about the role of social norms. And as Emma said, and as Brian said, there's been a lot of interest lately in the role of social norms as it relates to harmful behaviors. And so we produced two different resources that we can make available. One was a reading pack, which is available to all DFID and anyone else who's interested. But one that I also am drawing on quite a bit today was specifically this guidance note that we put together, which is on how to think about social norms as it relates to violence against women. So I wanted to thank Michael John Alexander Scott, who is one of the co-authors on the guidance note that I worked with him to produce, and he shared some slides with me, and I'm drawing on both his slides and my slides and sharing this update with you. So given that there's very little time, I just want to address three three topics. One is sort of, why should we address social norms? How can we think about diagnosing and measuring social norms? Is social norms really an important element of the phenomena or the behavior that we're trying to address? And then just a few observations about tackling them. Oops. Oh dear. Hold on a second, you guys. I did it wrong. I hit the wrong thing. Go back to the beginning. Okay, here we go. So one thing I think is really important to say up front is that, as Emma was saying, a combination of factors affect violence against women and girls. And a combination of factors also sort of form the foundation of social change processes. And so when we're thinking about social change, we need to think about things that happen at the individual level. So that's things maybe changing attitudes, empowering individuals and expanding their agencies. It's correcting false beliefs that they may have. All of these things we're used to when we're working on, let's say, women's empowerment programs. We also are quite used to, in violence against women programming, thinking about structural issues. So what are the laws, what are the ideologies that are informing the problem of different types of violence. Then there's the cog of this social change agenda that I like to think of as the material world. I mean, if we're trying to, for example, help keep girls in school, there are lots of different things that feed into that, but one of them may just be material realities. They don't have enough money in order to pay school fees. There aren't actual physical schools close enough for them to attend. The piece, though, that social norms get to is the green cog, which is the social. And I think it's our observation that we haven't spent as much time dealing with this social dimension of change. And as we'll talk about, one of the reasons that this is important is that if that piece is operative, that social norms piece is operative and stuck, sort of, if you think of it as gears, it means that the process of social change can grind to a halt. And so what we think is important is that we diagnose where social norms are important and where they may not be important, so that we know whether or not our intervention designs really need to focus on that social in order to make progress. And one thing I just wanted to say is that social norms is just one piece of the puzzle of what we need to be thinking about. I think there's been a tendency lately, since there's been so much talk about social norms, to sort of fall into the trap that we all fall into of looking for the magic bullet, the next thing. Well, social norms isn't a magic bullet, but it can be a missing cog along with some of the other things that we're traditionally do in our programming. So what exactly is a norm? A norm is a rule of behavior that a people in a group conform to because they believe two things. One is they believe that it's typical, it's what other people in their group do, and two, they believe that they ought to do it, that other people expect it of them. So I like to just think of it in a very simple way as what's typical and what's appropriate. And there's three important features of this. One is it has to do about my beliefs about others, okay? So it's not my individual attitude or belief, but what I think others expect of me. And that those others is what's called a reference group. And those reference groups can be different for different behaviors. So for example, if I'm living in a village and I'm concerned about certain behaviors and I have very close neighbors and I have a very strong community identity, I might be very concerned about what those individuals think. That may be my reference group. If I live in an urban shanty town or I've moved away from my village in a more autonomous or atomized, I guess I should say, setting, I might not actually even know who lives next to me. I might be thinking still back to my village or my faith community. And so you have to be thoughtful about the fact that for different behaviors, different reference groups may be salient or important, and that not necessarily that reference group, those people that are important to someone, may not be the people immediately around them. Another important feature is that social norms tend to be maintained by approval and disapproval. So we conform to them because we want to belong. All people have a sort of inherent need to belong. And so we either get rewards by conforming, or if we depart from a social expectation, we fear disapproval. So just thinking about a common example, if I start a new job and I'm noticing that everyone's working late, and I may myself believe that it's actually much more important to go home and be with your family. That's my value system. But I might be afraid not to do what everyone else is doing for fear that it will be looked down upon and affect my advancement. So that's an example of how if a norm is in place, it can actually override my individual belief or my individual judgment of what I'd like to do, which is why it can serve on break or to change my behavior. So when we think about social norms with respect to violence, there's two different ways to think about it. In some cases, a harmful or a violent behavior itself can be a social norm, okay? So the kind of classic one here is female genital cutting, or where if parents, or for example, are concerned that if their child is not cut, then they won't be marriageable, or they'll be considered unclean, or any number of things which are clearly fit the definition of a social norm, because fear of departing from it is one of the things that is maintaining the behavior in place. Now, with other violent behaviors, and in some cases I would put partner violence in this category, the behavior itself may not be a norm, okay? So that it may not be that men are ostracized, for example, if they don't beat their wives, but nonetheless, other norms can help hold the behavior in place. So here I like to think about norms as norms and beliefs as sort of a matrix. So if you think about partner violence, sometimes it's underpinned by other beliefs or norms, whether those be around gender roles, around family privacy, or around notions of male authority, that actually create social expectations that perpetuate men's use of violence. So I just want to get clear up front on constructs, because I think one of the things we haven't done particularly well when we think about programming is we tend to talk about gender norms as in a kind of woolly, I would say, or loose way. And within that, we embed ideologies and values and hierarchies of resources and attitudes. And actually, one of the things that we think it would be useful is if we got more disciplined in how we use these different constructs. So if we think about norms on the left-hand side, those are beliefs about others, and they exist for a group. So again, it's what's typical and what's appropriate in your reference group. On the right side, there's personal beliefs or individual beliefs. So if we talk about what I myself favor or disfavor, that would be, for example, an attitude. If I talk about what I believe to be morally right or wrong, that's a moral belief. And then actually sometimes behaviors are simply driven by factual beliefs. If I believe that my child will get sick if I don't bury a placenta after birth, I may be doing that behavior simply because I have a factual belief around the way the world works. So it's important for us to be distinguishing norms, beliefs, and attitudes. So if we think about partner violence, for example, and we can look at a whole matrix of things that feed into it. So there is, in many settings, the factual belief that women won't obey unless beaten, and that women need discipline to be good wives. You'll see that over and over again in qualitative data. There's also positive individual attitudes towards the practice. So many places, hitting is an acceptable form of discipline, whether that's hitting of women or hitting of children. There are normative expectations. So here is where it might go into the area of norms, where there may be masculinity norms in place where other men will look down on a man who can't keep his wife in line. There's other norms around family privacy often that feed into this, that the fear that disclosing violence will bring shame upon the family. Shame is a very strong indicator of a norm because it's a collective thing, whereas guilt is a very personal and individualized feeling. And then there's also sort of what we call scripts or gender roles about what it means to be a good wife or what it means to be a good husband. If you look at the theory behind all this, there's two sort of main social psychology theories that feed into this understanding of norms. One is called social influence, and that has to do with why we seek approval or positive benefit from belonging and identity, and the role that disapproval or sanction plays in causing people to conform. Another one, though, is socialization, and all of us know how oftentimes just through growing up in an environment, certain ideas become internalized, and ones related to gender are very strongly susceptible to being internalized because they're so constant. Almost everything you see in life is gendered in some way, and therefore once they become internalized, they also become what I call naturalized, meaning that oftentimes people can't even see them. They're just the way the world works. And so therefore, one of the things that needs to happen in social change programs is they need to be denaturalized. People need to be to recognize or be helped to recognize that these things are socially constructed. It's not that God made girls and boys a certain way for certain roles. It's that we have constructed that culturally and socially, and that different peoples around the world have constructed that differently. So I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the creative dynamic between kind of empowerment-based strategies and norms-based strategies. So within the women's movement, for example, we've done a lot around empowerment and building agency amongst women and girls. So expanding horizons and aspirations, building skills and self-efficacy, and encouraging critical reflection. Norms, though, can serve as a brake on that. So, for example, agency helps women and girls resist social expectations, but it doesn't transform those expectations. So, yes, we can help girls be able to be independent in the face of those social restrictions, but we also need to take on the task of trying to transform those restrictions so that there's more concordance between women's agency and the social expectations around her. So how to diagnose and measure norms? Just real quickly, I think the key questions here is first to ask whose opinion matters regarding the particular behavior in question. Is the behavior perceived as typical? And is it considered appropriate? And then sort of the key question is, are there consequences for non-compliance? For example, social sanctions. Oftentimes it's easiest to discern this through qualitative research, and we often use vignettes, which allow people to project what would happen in a certain situation. So you could say, for example, the wife of a man in your community disobeys him and he beats her. What would other men think of this man? And what would they think of him if he did not beat her? And you may find, for example, that they might approve of the behavior but not sanction it if he doesn't beat her. And so these are the kinds of techniques people are exploring to in order to try to figure out if something is a norm in the first instance. There's also quantitative ways to do this, and you can build them into kind of the traditional knowledge, attitude, and practice surveys that you're familiar with. So practices are what I do, attitudes and knowledge are what I think or what I believe, but norms are the bottom half of this quadrant. So norms, you need to measure what I believe others do. So is it typical behavior? And what I believe others think I should do. Is it considered appropriate? So finally, just a few thoughts on tackling social norms. here the goal is really to create new social expectations. So it's not enough just to change attitudes. We need to actually change the collective expectations around the behavior. One of the things that behavioral science has shown us is that people give attention to things based on its salience. And what that means is that if you draw someone's attention to something, it affects their behavior. And so one of the concerns that social norms theory gives us is that we have to be careful that in doing our awareness campaigns, we're not reinforcing the notion that it's normative by saying that it's typical. And I actually think the 1 in 3 number that we throw around so liberally now is actually dangerous, because it implies that it's 1 in 3 of everyone around you. And what we saw in the information that Emma showed us is that, yes, on average globally it's 1 in 3, but some places it's much higher than that, and some places it's much, 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 much lower than that. And so we need to be careful that we're not using the 1 in 3 language in campaigns in areas where actually 1 in 3 women are not being beaten or attacked in that setting, because we may be actually feeding into a negative norm. By contrast, what we can do is we can emphasize positive norms. So here's just 2 examples where on colleges where they say 74% of college men would intervene to prevent a sexual assault. So this is saying, look, a lot more people would intervene than you might think. Or the one on the right, I listen when a girl says no, do you? So again, this is emphasizing and making salient the idea that others would take a good behavior as opposed to emphasizing the typicality of the negative behavior. We also need to promote public debate and deliberation. Individuals need to see and hear from others in their reference group who may be changing, so that the expectations change of the whole group. One way to do this is, and this is frequently done anyway, but it fits with social norms theory, is to publicize role models and the benefits of new behavior. So role models can persuade people to adopt new norms. They can condemn existing norms or simply give people an alternative that they haven't been able to envision so far. They can show that a new behavior or a new way of being and acting is possible. And finally, one thing that we know is that we have to have what we call organized diffusion. It's not enough to change just the attitudes or beliefs of a small group of people. That needs to be catalyzed through broader societal change, because until we hit that sort of critical mass or the notion of a tipping point, you won't change the social expectations of people about what is the appropriate way to act in a situation. So the key thing is, how can the change be scaled up beyond the direct beneficiaries of, let's say, a curriculum-based approach to the wider society? And so community mobilization strategies like those in SASA would be one example. So I'm just going to stop there because I know we're short on time, but that gives you a really quick sort of overview of some of the thinking that you can find in the reading pack or in the guidance note.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurie. What I would like to suggest is, okay, now we're happy to, I understand, well, first of all, that Beth has unfortunately not been able to follow the presentations because of some technical problems. So I would like to open up the floor to questions from anybody who is who's listening. So if you have any questions for either of our presenters, please type them in the chat box on the side. And while we wait for people to type in their questions, I guess I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask the first one. Um, and I was interested, Emma. You kind of teased us a little bit with the potential of epigenetics at the end of your presentation, and I'm just personally curious. Can you say a little bit more about that? What where do you see that fitting into this sort of picture?
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think no one's really doing it yet very much, although there is some work that is, I guess, more on the response side that's happening. But looking at, for example, how there's a study being done in South Africa at the moment looking at women who have been raped and then testing, so doing research with them and then a control group of women who haven't, but also testing biological markers of stress and other things, and looking at the long-term sort of health consequences and how sort of psychological strain manifests in physical biological ways. But then there's also, some emerging things around how, for example, childhood trauma affects brain development in children that may relate to some of the sort of risk factor behaviours we see around antisocial behaviour. So is it that the brain development effect of childhood trauma is a pathway that is leading towards violence perpetration later in life, and how does that play out with the environmental factors that contribute as well? So yeah, how do it's the sort of the interconnections of the biological changes with the environment, and I guess potentially we also know that about brain plasticity, so that we know that things are continually evolving and changing in that area as well, and it's not as fixed as we perhaps once thought.
Okay, so it's really looking at the taking a biological medical sort of approach to understanding some of at least one branch of the root causes, perhaps of
yeah, and how it relates to or how it's affected by the environment. So recognizing that they interact with each other.
Okay. Okay. Well, okay. There's several questions are popping up now on the side, so we would just take these in order as they come. I think the first one is very very interesting from Mandy. Has the research looked into the role of faith leaders in bringing about social change? Do either of you want to comment on that?
So I can just say a little bit about that. I mean, one of the, a couple of the programs that we are evaluating as part of the DFID-funded What Works to Prevent Violence program specifically are focused on engaging with faith leaders as opinion leaders in the community. And I think it's a very promising strategy in my mind, partly because if you look at the ways in which some of these norms are justified, people frequently will turn back to notions of, well, God made things this way. God, or the Bible says that men should be the head of the household, or men should control, women should submit to male authority. And so while you can find equally, you can find other passages that counter, the idea of that in the Bible or in Islam or in various different religious traditions. It frequently is sort of the touchstone that people use. And so I think if you can open up and start a dialogue about, again, the idea that these things are are open to interpretation, that they're not necessarily, that one interpretation is not necessarily the truth. I mean, you can create more space for people to discuss things. I don't know if you want to say something, Emma.
Yeah, no, I think there's quite a lot being done on it at the moment. Not so much. I mean, there's not many evaluations finished yet, but certainly a lot of programming happening on it with likes of tier fund. So, and certainly in the Muslim majority world, it's coming, I think, from both sides. That I think there's sort of some internal reflections in perhaps among certain groups of leaders, but at the same time, I think there's been a really important push from, women's rights groups and feminists, for example, feminist Islamic scholars who have been challenging some of the standard or some of the interpretation of the Quran that's used to justify violence or the subordination of women. So I think it's important that that's kind of coming from both sides, because we can definitely try and encourage and promote and work with faith leaders in some contexts, but in some contexts they're not particularly open to that. But I think there's push coming, positive, I guess, advocacy and coming from the women's rights movement in different places. That's really important.
I mean, just one additional thing is I think that some of the most fascinating meetings I've ever attended were from years ago with women living under Muslim laws, and that's a group which brings together, women from Muslim majority countries, and they share for the first time, and they often realize for the first time that even that the regimes that they live in are dramatically different, right? So that in some places women have, can't drive, and everyone else, they can. In some places, Islam is interpreted in one way, and in another country it's an entirely different way, and that's a really effective strategy for denaturalizing that I was talking about before, sort of recognizing that these things are actually open to interpretation, that someone is interpreting these texts. You have the same text, but you have this incredibly wide range of ways in which it operates or being interpreted across settings. And it's very empowering and opening for women to realize that, because if they live in one setting, again, they can only imagine that that's what the way the world is and what Islam says.
Thanks. The second question was from Bernadette Crawford about what are your views on the He for She campaign? Do you want to say a few words about that if you're familiar with it?
I'm going to give you that one.
Thanks. I think it's a really important. That question raises, I think, an issue or an area of debate and tension that is perhaps playing out in the field, or has been playing out in the field for some time, and that is the work around engaging men and boys. And I think, personally, I think we need to work with everyone. I think, men and boys, individuals, communities, state leaders, etc. I think the tension has been that
Can you say what the program has attempted to do, just very briefly, what it's about?
Okay. He for She is a UN-led campaign. You probably may have seen it because what's her name? That from that famous actress Emma Watson. Emma Watson gave the speech at the United Nations, and it's basically calling on men to stand up for gender equality and women's rights. So the he for she. So in the violence field, there's certainly it's kind of like before social norms. It was working with men and boys was the kind of sexy kind of programming to do. and the tension has been that there's been some criticism that that has taken away resources and work from women and grassroots women's movements. I think what one of the readings that I've recommended talks about engaging men and boys, and I think what we're seeing is what needs to happen is it's not about engaging men and boys separately from engaging women and girls, that it needs to be done together. It needs to be done in a way that's fundamentally addressing gender inequality and harmful gender roles. It needs to be gender transformative, so to speak, and so that it's that type of work is most effective, rather than, I guess, just adding men and boys as a program strategy or an end in and of itself. Laurie?
No, that's fine.
Thanks. There's a couple of there's a lot of questions here, so I'm going to try to maybe see if I can combine a few of them. There's a few questions here that are about well, changing social expectations. So there's a pair of questions that are about how do you move from changing attitudes to changing social expectations, and what happens when you change expectations. Sometimes Carol Ballantyne says the sanctions themselves of disapproval and ostracism can have impacts on individuals, which can also be bad. So how can you change the expectations that people have in a way that doesn't also cause harm itself?
Right. So I think there's what you combine. Yeah, I was going to say there's two questions there. I mean, the first one, I think the first one is, how do you move from attitudes to norms? And I think in some respects, I think you'll have to go back to the readings and I'll give more information, but I think the key here is sometimes it has to do with who you're working with. So if something is if norms are not in play, and it's really something driven by individual attitudes or beliefs, you can work with that set of individuals, right? So if it's adolescent girls, you work with adolescent girls. If norms are in play, meaning that those girls are not doing necessarily what they would like to do, but are being restricted by expectations of, let's say, their parents or their peers, then you have to program with the peers or the parents. So some of it is, where do you direct your programming? And when you're dealing with the normative approach, you oftentimes have to direct your programming to the reference group in addition to the individuals. And you need to make that shift visible. So there's different strategies you can use to try to visibilize change. In terms of the sanctioning, there's two ways to go about something. One is you can try to sanction negatively a behavior you don't like, right? And as the questioner points out, sometimes that can be a tricky thing. So for example, in Tanzania, we're doing work around transactional sex and sexual exploitation of young girls. So the concern was, okay, older men who are having sex with young girls, and this kind of traditional notion of sugar daddies, and they created this whole campaign to try to shame the sugar daddies. Well, what happened was it oversimplified those relationships, and men just find themselves out of that category. They're like, well, I'm not one of those. I'm just having a relationship with a young woman, and so, or, it's a very tricky thing. So most social norms approaches prefer to work on creating new positive norms focusing on a positive and drawing more people towards that, as opposed to dismantling a negative. Because if you're dismantling a negative norm, you run into more problems, whereas you can then say, okay, what is the behavior that we're trying to encourage, and how can we create that as a new norm and attract more people. In effect, you attract people from the negative to the positive, as opposed to trying to just dismantle the negative. I don't know if that's very clear, but it would be, it's one strategy to try to avoid negative consequences of some of the more, taking a more negative approach to things.
Okay. Maybe this will be a quick one to answer. I don't know. Susanna, going back earlier, Susanna Carmody asks, are there indications on what the optimal size is for what we define as a community? What is it that we mean by a community when we're trying to intervene in these kinds of ways? I mean, there's many different scales. I think you've talked about very local interventions to national campaigns. Do you have any thoughts on what constitutes a community in trying to intervene in norms?
Well, I think it's much more useful to think about this notion of reference group, because if the reference group, if the people that you're looking to who live geographically in your community, right, then you may have to intervene at a geographical community level. If your community is actually an ethnic identity, or it might be your friends at school. If you're trying to decide whether to smoke, the reference group might be your peers and your parents, and nothing about the physical community in which you live. So it's much more. It's while we have tended so far in our programming around violence prevention to do these sort of community-wide approaches, it's because we're working in rural areas where everyone knows everyone's business. They're very small. They tend to be defined in that way. The norms that we're working on tend to operate at multiple levels within a geographic space. But that's not always the case. So I wouldn't think in terms of community. I would think in terms of whose opinion matters on this issue, and therefore, who do you need to reach?
Emma, do you want to say anything on that as well?
Laurie's answer is perfect, so I don't know that I can add anything to that.
Maybe I'll pick up a question from Christiana from Plan UK, who talks about comprehensive sexual education programs. Have either of you explored the link between comprehensive sexual education programs and social norms, and have these been an effective way to shift social norms at all?
So what I would say is I'm a firm believer in comprehensive sexuality education, and I think it can be incredible. I've been on the board of an organization that has done that for years. But most sexuality education is actually works at an individual level. So yes, it will change individual beliefs and attitudes and potentially behaviors. And if you do that in enough people, then you can definitely start to shift social expectations. But I would say if you were working in an area and, for example, you just introduced comprehensive sexuality education in a school, and you didn't think about the other aspects of that child's life that is going to be defining what they perceive as social expectations for them, like their parents or the messages on TV or their peer group, you're probably going to influence their ideas and attitudes but you're not necessarily going to be successful in changing the social expectations around them. And so I think it is an incredible, important piece of work that needs to be done. I think it's probably not it's not necessarily a key strategy in changing social norms unless you can get it to a scale where you're actually reaching so many people that you're changing generations of people's attitudes towards sexuality.
I think I totally agree. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, and but it's not the only thing. And I think the evidence around school-based work perhaps helps to highlight that, which has found, from what we know so far, that curriculums, whether it's sexuality education or more specifically on violence against women or gender-based violence, curriculums on their own are not as effective as what has been termed a whole-of-school approach, which looks at the school culture, looks at training teachers, it looks at parents, it looks at the community around the school and these reinforcing, I guess, factors and influences that go on in a child's life, like Laurie has said. So, because even if they learn something in school, if all the messages that they get outside school are telling them something totally different, then it doesn't have as big an impact. I think that probably applies to comprehensive sexuality education too.
Emma, there was one question here that sort of is specifically directed at you, so I thought I'd highlight it. Mette Nielsen asks that I'm interested in what Emma raised about how to use response work with survivors as an entry point for social norms work. Can access to services help normalize and illustrate the role of sanctions to change behaviors over time? And is there any evidence of this approach working or examples of programs?
Yeah, so part of the What Works program, I wonder if I have it. It's on the website. You can look at the What Works website. But one of the reviews that we did was actually looking at whether response programs have a preventative effect. So it's not their primary purpose, but do they, in delivering their response service of various types, do they actually reduce rates of violence? It's the pink, if you look at our What Works stuff, it's the pink coloured one is the response mechanisms one. And I think, we don't know enough yet, because not surprisingly, projects that are dedicated to response don't normally measure necessarily the outcome, for example, of reduced rates of violence, because it's not their primary area of interest. But it would be great if they did do that more. The ones that were found to be promising in terms of actual prevention were protection orders with proactive arrest, shelters, paralegal programs, and counselling and psychological support. I think at the same time, Laurie can maybe talk about it, the macro level side of things, but I don't know that we know for sure, but we certainly assume that the existence of laws and policies that say criminalise violence against women or domestic violence create or set in some way, at least say that society thinks this is unacceptable, and that is part of the process of setting a norm that says these things won't be condoned. And I think the implementation of those, and also I guess strong and comprehensive response services also say to society that that we care enough about this issue that we're going to invest in responding ethically and effectively to women who have experienced violence. So I think they're very important. We don't know a lot technically about how much they decrease rates of violence, basically because it hasn't been measured much. But I think they have to be part of an integrated sort of approach to violence prevention and response. That's Laurie, do you want to add anything?
Sure.
Sure.
Oh, I said just one thing that sort of comes out of the macro level analysis. So that's where we've been looking at the association between different macro level factors and the prevalence of partner violence in different settings. Is, interestingly enough, and again, this is all tentative, so I don't want to overread this, but when you look at laws, the laws that seem to correlate best with lower levels of violence are actually not laws criminalizing domestic violence. They're laws that have to do with women's economic entitlements, and they're laws to do with like family law and maintenance and things like that. So in settings where there's inequalities in law related to child custody, related to rights in marriage, you see much higher levels of violence, partner violence, than areas where there's equity. And I think as a movement, we have probably really missed opportunities to join forces with focusing on legal reforms that may not be as directly related to, criminalizing domestic violence. But if we're actually looking to try to shift levels of violence at a population level, we probably need to be looking much more to these types of legal reforms, because even things around, one of the really interesting things, I haven't tested it yet quantitatively, but we're starting to see countries that are changing the notion of male headship of families. That by law, for example, Rwanda just passed a law saying that women and men are equal heads of families. And we know that that notion of male headship and male authority in the family appears to be so critical to the underlying norm around male rights to chastise female behavior, that things like that, I think, might actually be far more productive than all the energy that women's groups and others have put into trying to transform what are basically highly dysfunctional justice systems in a lot of these settings, and are going to take, decades and generations to make accountable to anyone, much less to, victims of partner violence. So I would encourage us to think much more broadly about where we focus our energy on law reform.
Thanks. There's quite a lot of questions, and we're not going to be able to tackle them all. But maybe I'll just ask one final question of you, which is I think the question that Nancy B asks is interesting. How do you distinguish between a norm-based strategy and an empowerment strategy? Are they different, or are they related? Are they what's the difference between changing norms and empowerment?
Well, so to me, empowerment is things like where you would work with women to expand their horizons about what they think is possible. I mean, to give them skills, change their attitudes, change their aspirations, create more self-efficacy. So in effect, it empowers women to act despite norms, potentially. So it says, frequently all social change happens on the backs, right, of those brave people who say, I'm going to do something even if others think it's wrong. I'm not going to treat someone this way even if everyone around me is, or I'm going to fight for something I believe in even if there's a cost to me. So empowerment is, I think, arming people to take those brave steps. But to me, the norms-based strategies are trying to change the environment around that person. So in effect, if we can, if we can bring down if we can change the norms so that they're more supportive and more concordant with progressive attitudes, then it's going to be easier. So, because some people are always going, no matter what. I mean, you can have the strongest norm in place, and there will be some people who are going to say, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. And empowerment programs can broaden that group of people who feel empowered to resist. But there's always, but it's oftentimes quite difficult, right? So if we can actually shift the norms so there's not the social cost of being on that vanguard, then I think we make it far easier for people to join that group of people who are going against the grain.
Thank you very much. Emma, do you want to have any a chance for any closing remarks?
No, not to that particular question, but just to say thank you for having me, and yeah, it's been a great discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, everybody, for the technical problems we had at the beginning.